Imagine a world without safety, and it's a time where survival was a daily gamble. What if you lost everything, your family, your home, your future? What if you were an orphaned girl in 550 AD? Number 10. The grim shadow of starvation and exposure. In the year 550 AD, across what was once the mighty Roman Empire and its successor kingdoms, the very fabric of society was thin and frayed, especially for the most vulnerable. For an orphaned girl, this meant a constant gnawing hunger and the chilling dread of the elements. There were no soup kitchens, no public shelters, no organized charities in the way we understand them today. Life was inherently local, reliant on family and community bonds, and without those, an orphaned girl was utterly adrift in a world indifferent to her plight. If her parents succumbed to the frequent plagues, the devastating famines, or the constant warfare that scarred the landscape, her access to food vanished overnight. The family land, if they had any, might be seized or simply fall into disuse, leaving her with absolutely nothing. Consider the daily grind. The majority of people were peasants tied to the land, their sustenance directly dependent on the harvest. A bad crop year, a locust infestation, or a sudden flood could mean widespread famine. For a girl who had no land, no family to share meager rations, and no adult to plead her case, the prospects were truly dire. She would be forced to scavenge for scraps, perhaps competing with dogs in the streets of a struggling town, or foraging in barren fields outside a village. This wasn't about choosing healthy options. It was about finding anything, absolutely anything, that would keep her stomach from cramping with unbearable pain. Root vegetables, discarded grains, even bark, or desperate attempts to catch small animals would become her focus. But without the knowledge, tools, or strength of an adult, these efforts would often be futile. Beyond hunger, the very air itself could become an enemy. Winters in many parts of Europe and the Near East were brutal with snow and ice, making travel and foraging impossible. Without a roof over her head, an orphan girl was at the mercy of the bitter cold. Imagine the numbing chill, the frostbite creeping into fingers and toes, the constant shivering that racked her small body. She might try to huddle in abandoned buildings under market stalls or in the doorways of churches, but even there the cold would seep into her bones. Clothes were precious, often handed down or patched until they were threadbare. An orphaned girl would likely possess only the rags on her back, offering little protection against the biting winds and persistent dampness. Hypothermia was a swift and silent killer, and for a weakened, malnourished child it was an ever-present danger. Summers, too, brought their own perils. Extreme heat, sunstroke, and dehydration were real threats, especially when water sources were scarce or contaminated. Without a safe place to rest, without a protector to ensure she drank clean water, an orphaned girl could quickly succumb to the elements. And the ever-present flies and other insects would carry disease, clinging to her unwashed skin, seeking entry to her body through open sores, or simply through the air she breathed. The combination of malnutrition and exposure made her incredibly vulnerable to sickness, turning even a common cold into a life-threatening illness. The stark reality was that starvation was not just a lack of food. It was a slow, agonizing process that eroded the body and the mind. It left children too weak to walk, too tired to think, and too vulnerable to resist the multitude of other dangers that stalked the unprotected. Exposure was a constant companion, whether from the biting winds of winter or the relentless sun of summer. For an orphaned girl in 550, had hunger and the elements were not abstract concepts, they were the very real, inescapable boundaries of her existence, daily threatening to claim her last breath. There was no easy escape from this harsh reality, and, without the warmth of a hearth or the security of a meal, her life was a continuous struggle against forces beyond her control. Number 9. The chains of forced servitude and slavery. In the fragmented world of 550 AD, an orphaned girl's survival could quickly turn into a grim form of bondage. Without family to protect her, without land or status, she was little more than property waiting to be claimed. Slavery, though not always as prominent as in earlier Roman times, persisted and even flourished in various forms across the Byzantine Empire and the emerging Germanic kingdoms. For an orphaned girl, this wasn't about being captured in a faraway war. It was about being exploited by those nearby, or simply being desperate enough to sell herself, or be sold by a desperate relative, into a life of forced servitude. Imagine a young girl, perhaps no older than 7 or 8, her parents gone, her home lost. She might wander into a village or a town weak from hunger. What happens next? Powerful landowner, a wealthy merchant, or even a struggling peasant might see her. They wouldn't see a child needing compassion, but a pair of hands, an unpaid laborer. She could be taken in, given a meager bowl of gruel, and in return expected to work from dawn until dusk. This was a form of informal slavery, where her person was essentially owned, her labor entirely at the master's disposal, and her future non-existent beyond the confines of that household. She would sweep floors, tend to fires, fetch water, care for livestock, or perform endless repetitive tasks, all without pay, without a day of rest, and without the hope of freedom. The legal status of slavery in 550 had varied. In the Byzantine East, under Emperor Justinian's reformed law codes, there were efforts to regulate slavery, but it was still a deeply ingrained institution. Slaves could be acquired through birth to a slave mother, through capture in war, or through self-sale during extreme poverty. For an orphaned girl, the latter was a terrifying possibility. If she was starving and desperate, she might agree to become a slave in exchange for food and shelter, signing away her freedom, perhaps unknowingly for a fleeting moment of relief. Once a slave, her legal rights were virtually non-existent. She could not own property, testify in court, or marry without her master's permission. Her children, should she have any, would also be born into slavery, perpetuating the cycle of bondage. In the Germanic kingdoms that had risen from the ashes of the Western Roman Empire, slavery and various forms of serfdom were also prevalent. While not always the chattel slavery of the classical world, the concept of a person belonging to another, owing endless labor and having no personal agency, was very real. An orphaned girl in Anglo-Saxon, England, or Frankish Gaul might find herself bound to a lord's estate, her labor tied to the land, unable to leave, unable to marry without permission, and completely subject to the lord's will. While technically different from outright slavery, the practical reality for an orphaned girl was often indistinguishable. A life of unremitting toil, vulnerability, and lack of freedom. The horror of slavery wasn't just the hard work. It was the complete dehumanization. An orphaned girl in servitude had no control over her body, her time, or her future. She could be sold, gifted, or traded like an animal. She was vulnerable to physical abuse, and sexual exploitation was an ever-present threat, particularly for a young girl. There was no one to hear her cries, no legal recourse, no social safety net to intervene. Her identity was stripped away, replaced by her status as a tool, an asset, a piece of property. Her name might even be forgotten, replaced by a simple label of the girl or the servant. Prospect of this endless, inescapable servitude was one of the bleakest fates for an orphaned girl, condemning her to a life where her dreams, if she even dared to have them, were utterly impossible. Number 8. The shadow of child marriage and exploitation. For an orphaned girl in 550 had the concept of a childhood free from adult responsibilities or exploitation, without parents to arrange a suitable match, or more importantly, to protect her from predatory arrangements. She was alarmingly susceptible to child marriage, often as a means of securing labor or land, rather than establishing a true family unit. This was not a romantic union, but a transactional one, stripping her of autonomy and plunging her into an adult life she was woefully unprepared for, often with devastating consequences. The legal and social norms of the era allowed for girls to be married at incredibly young ages. While Roman law often set the age of consent for marriage at 12, for girls' practical realities, especially in poorer or more remote areas, or in the Germanic kingdoms with different customs, could see girls betrothed or even wedded even younger. For an orphan girl, these norms became an immediate threat. Without a dowry, which was often a crucial part of a respectable marriage, and without a family to negotiate on her behalf, she was seen as a burden, but also potentially as a cheap solution for a man seeking a wife or a family in need of a domestic servant. Imagine a girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, her parents having died of plague. She might be taken in by a distant relative, or even a stranger. The initial act might seem compassionate, but soon the relative or guardian would see an opportunity to offload the burden while gaining something in return. A marriage could be arranged with an older man, perhaps a widower with children who needed a stepmother and housekeeper, or a farmer who needed an extra pair of hands. Her youth and lack of family would mean she had absolutely no say in the matter. She would be handed over her future sealed without any understanding of what marriage truly entailed, particularly for someone so young. The reality of child marriage for an orphaned girl was often one of brutal exploitation. She would be expected to perform all the duties of an adult woman: cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, agricultural labor. Her body, still developing, would be subjected to the demands of physical labor and, inevitably, childbearing. The mortality rates for women in childbirth were staggeringly high, and for a girl whose body was not yet ready for pregnancy, the risks were even greater. Many child brides would die during their first or second childbirth, their lives cut tragically short before they had truly begun. Beyond the physical demands, there was the profound psychological toll. She would be living with a man often much older than her, potentially abusive, and certainly not a figure of comfort or love. Her innocence would be shattered, her autonomy non-existent. She would be a wife in name, but in practice, she would often function as an unpaid servant, a child-bearer, and an object. There was no escape, no divorce for the powerless, no societal mechanism to protect her from such arrangements. Her bleak prospect was not merely an early marriage, but an early, unchosen, and often dangerous path into an adult life of servitude and vulnerability, with her youth and person exploited for the convenience or gain of others. This was a future dictated by desperation and the harsh realities of the time, rather than any hope of happiness or security. Number 7. The perilous path of prostitution for an orphan girl in 550, and facing the brutal realities of hunger, exposure, and a complete lack of protection. The descent into prostitution was a desperate and terrifyingly common path, offering a grim form of temporary survival at an unimaginably high cost. Without family, without skills, and without any legitimate means of earning a living, a young girl could easily find herself pushed into this dark corner of society, her body becoming her only commodity. Imagine a girl perhaps just entering her teenage years, having lost everything. She has no roof over her head, no food in her stomach, and no one to turn to. She might be approached by a pimp, an older woman, or even another desperate individual who promises her food, shelter, and perhaps a modicum of safety in exchange for her body. Choice, if it could even be called that, was between almost certain death from starvation or exposure and a life of profound degradation and danger. For a young, vulnerable girl, the immediate promise of survival, however fleeting, could be overwhelming. Prostitution in 550, and whether in the bustling cities of the Byzantine East, like Constantinople, or in the smaller, grittier towns of the West, was an unregulated and dangerous profession. There were no health services, no legal protections, and certainly no social support for those involved. Girls caught in this life would often be housed in brothels, effectively imprisoned by their handlers, or forced to ply their trade on the streets, enduring public shame and constant threats. They would be at the mercy of their clients, often brutal and uncaring, and their pimps, who would take the vast majority of their meager earnings, leaving them with just enough to survive, perpetually indebted and trapped. The physical toll was immense. Diseases, especially sexually transmitted infections for which there was no cure, would ravage their bodies. Constant exposure to the elements, poor nutrition, and lack of proper hygiene would lead to a litany of other ailments, from skin infections to respiratory illnesses. Injuries from violent clients were a constant threat, and without access to medical care, even minor wounds could become infected and life-threatening. The life expectancy for girls and women trapped in prostitution was incredibly short, often cut down by disease, violence, or sheer exhaustion before they reached their 20s. The psychological devastation was equally profound. Constant trauma, the loss of dignity, the relentless fear, and the societal condemnation would shatter their spirits. They would live lives of isolation, shunned by respectable society, with no hope of escape or rehabilitation. There were no social services, no pathways out of this existence. Once branded as a prostitute, a girl's reputation was irrevocably ruined, making it impossible for her to integrate back into any conventional life. Even if she somehow managed to escape her circumstances, she would be forever an outcast, condemned by society, and bearing the scars of her unbearable choices. This was not a choice made from desire, but from utter desperation, and it offered no future beyond a painful and early end, making it one of the most terrifying and bleak prospects for an orphaned girl of the era. Number 6. The dark well of illiteracy and ignorance. For an orphaned girl in 550 AD, the ability to read, write, or even think critically was not just a luxury. Its absence was a severe handicap that plunged her into a world of profound disadvantage. Education, even rudimentary literacy, was a rare commodity, largely confined to the wealthy, the monastic orders, or the scribes of powerful rulers. For a girl stripped of her family, access to any form of learning was virtually impossible, leaving her utterly unprepared for anything beyond the most basic physical labor and making her susceptible to every form of exploitation. Imagine a world without books, without public schools, without any form of standardized instruction. Learning was typically familial, passed down from parent to child, or through apprenticeships within a craft or trade. For an orphaned girl, these avenues were closed off. Her parents, if they were common folk, might not have been literate themselves, but they would have taught her the skills necessary for survival within their specific social niche, be it farming, weaving, or household management. Without them, she was cut adrift, unable to inherit even that basic knowledge. This meant she would be completely reliant on oral information, unable to read signs, messages, or any form of written communication. In a society where legal documents, religious texts, and even basic transactions were often written, her illiteracy made her entirely dependent on others. She could be easily deceived, defrauded, or manipulated. If she were ever involved in a legal dispute, which was highly unlikely given her lack of status but possible through theft or accusation, she would be completely lost without someone to read documents to her or explain legal procedures. Her inability to understand contracts, even for servitude, would put her at a profound disadvantage. Beyond practical matters, illiteracy meant a profound intellectual deprivation. She would be cut off from stories, histories, and the wider world beyond her immediate harsh surroundings. Her understanding of the world would be limited to what she could observe or what she was told, often by people with their own agendas. This intellectual isolation would stunt her development, making it difficult for her to reason, question, or articulate her own thoughts. Even if she had the courage to do so, she would be easily led, unable to discern truth from falsehood, and thus more susceptible to cults superstitions, or deceptive promises. The lack of education also meant a profound limitation on her potential for self-improvement or advancement. There were no professional careers open to illiterate women, let alone orphaned ones. She could not become a scribe, a healer with written knowledge, or even a manager of a complex household. Her future was confined to the most menial, repetitive, and often dangerous forms of labor. She would remain at the very bottom rung of society without any means to lift herself up through knowledge or skill. The dark well of illiteracy was not just about not knowing how to read. It was about being denied the tools for self-determination, for understanding the world, and for protecting herself from the countless dangers that preyed upon the ignorant and the vulnerable in 550. Her future was sealed by this lack, her intellect a treasure, never unearthed. Number 5. The pervasive threat of disease and untreated illness. In 550, even a minor cut could be a death sentence, and the prospect of an orphaned girl surviving a serious illness was practically without family to care for her, without access to even the most rudimentary forms of medicine, and living in conditions of constant filth and malnutrition. Disease was an omnipresent and relentless enemy, a far more common killer than violence or starvation for those who managed to avoid immediate dangers. The world of 550 odd dangers, the world of 550 odd extent in most places. Human and animal waste often accumulated in streets and near water sources, providing fertile breeding grounds for bacteria and viruses. Clean water was a luxury, and contamination was rampant, leading to widespread outbreaks of dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and other debilitating gastrointestinal diseases. For an orphaned girl, constantly on the move or confined to unsanitary spaces, accessing safe drinking water was a near impossibility. A bout of severe diarrhea could quickly lead to fatal dehydration, especially for a malnourished child whose body was already weakened. Then there were the widespread epidemics that regularly swept across continents, wiping out huge swaths of the population. The most infamous was the plague of Justinian, which began just a few years before 550 AD and raged for centuries, devastating the Byzantine Empire and beyond. This was a bubonic plague, incredibly virulent and terrifyingly deadly. If a girl contracted the plague, she would experience sudden fever, chills, overwhelming fatigue, and then the telltale swollen, painful lymph nodes, or buboes. Without any understanding of how disease spread or any effective treatment, the chances of survival were minuscule. For an orphan girl alone and uncared for, falling ill with the plague meant almost certain agonizing death, often in isolation, as panic communities would shun the sick to avoid contagion. Even common childhood diseases, like measles, mumps, or chickenpox, which are rarely life-threatening today, were incredibly dangerous in 550 AD Pratt. Without vaccines, without even basic nursing care like keeping a fever down or ensuring hydration, these illnesses could easily lead to complications like pneumonia, blindness, or brain damage, often proving fatal. Respiratory infections, such as pneumonia or tuberculosis, were also rampant, exacerbated by damp, cold conditions and crowded, smoky living spaces. Persistent cough could quickly become a deadly illness for a body already struggling to survive. For an orphaned girl, the lack of care compounded every illness. There was no one to bring her a warm drink, no one to change a feverish compress, no one to speak comforting words as her body battled a relentless pathogen. She would be left to suffer alone, her immune system already compromised by hunger and exposure. Even if she survived the initial illness, the long-term effects of chronic disease, malnutrition, and recurrent infections would leave her permanently weakened, susceptible to further bouts of sickness, and likely shorten her already precarious life. Constant threat of disease was not just a possibility. It was a certainty, looming over every moment of her existence and offering a bleak, painful, and often solitary end. Number 4. The ever-present danger of violence and lawlessness. For an orphaned girl in 550 AD, the world was not just devoid of safety nets. It was actively hostile, a place where the rule of law was often tenuous and physical violence a constant, brutal possibility. Without the protection of a family or a male guardian, she was incredibly vulnerable to aggression from individuals, gangs, and even soldiers. With virtually no hope of justice or redress, her body was her only possession, and it was perpetually at risk. Across the former Roman lands, the collapse of centralized authority in the West had led to widespread instability. While the Eastern Roman or Byzantine empires still maintained a stronger state apparatus, even there, law enforcement outside of major cities was often weak or corrupt. Brigands and outlaws roamed the countryside, preying on travelers and isolated communities. Disbanded soldiers, or those whose pay was irregular, might turn to raiding. Even within villages and towns, local strongmen or petty criminals could operate with impunity, knowing there was little to stop. For an orphaned girl, constantly moving or living in the open, she was an easy target, a soft mark for anyone with ill intent. Physical assault was a daily risk. She could be beaten for begging, kicked for being in the wrong place, or attacked simply out of cruelty or frustration. Her lack of family meant no one would retaliate on her behalf. No one would speak up for her. She was invisible to the mechanisms of justice, which typically relied on kinship groups and social standing. If she were to report an attack, who would believe her? Who would care enough to investigate? The answer, devastatingly, was almost certainly no one. Her word against that of an adult, particularly a male, would carry no weight. Sexual violence was an even darker and more pervasive threat. A young, unprotected girl was seen by some as an easy target for rape, with little fear of consequence. The laws of the time, while condemning such acts, were often ineffective in protecting the most vulnerable. Cases of rape were difficult to prove, and the victim often suffered further shame and ostracization. For an orphaned girl, this was not just a legal failing. It was a complete violation of her person, leaving deep psychological scars and potentially physical consequences, such as unwanted pregnancy, which for a young unmoored girl would likely lead to death during childbirth. Furthermore, the very real dangers of kidnapping and forced abduction were ever present. Children, especially girls, could be snatched and sold into slavery, forced into marriage, or exploited for labor far from their known surroundings. There were no missing persons, alerts, no widespread communication networks. Once gone, a girl was truly gone, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The constant fear of physical harm, of being accosted, beaten, or taken, would be a relentless source of terror. An orphaned girl in 550 AD, Eve, not just on the edge of survival, but on the knife edge of violence, her life a constant, terrifying gamble against the brutal whims of a lawless world. Number 3. The bleakness of absolute legal and social helplessness. For an orphaned girl in 550, and the concept of having any legal rights, any recourse, or any recognized place within the social structure was virtually non-existent. She was, in essence, a non-person, in the eyes of the law and society, utterly without agency or protection. This meant she could be abused, exploited, or even killed, with little to no legal consequence for her tormentors, and no path to self-advocacy or justice. In the legal systems of the time, whether under Byzantine Roman law or the various Germanic customary laws, an individual's standing was almost entirely determined by their family, their land ownership, and their gender. Women in general held fewer rights than men, often requiring a male guardian to conduct legal affairs. Children, naturally, had even fewer. An orphaned girl, however, combined all the disadvantages. No family to represent her interests, no land to claim, and no male protector. She was a complete anomaly in a system built on established hierarchies and networks. Consider a simple scenario: theft. If an orphaned girl was robbed of her meager possessions, perhaps the only blanket she owned, or a piece of scavenged food, she would have no one to report it to. Even if she found a sympathetic ear, she would not be able to stand in court as a witness, as her testimony would likely be considered unreliable or inadmissible due to her status. She had no one to swear an oath on her behalf, no family to back her claim, and no property to establish her credibility. The thief would walk free and she would remain utterly bereft. This legal helplessness extended to all aspects of her life. If she was forced into servitude or prostitution, she had no legal avenues for escape. She could not sue her master or pimp, she could not petition a judge, and she could not even claim her own freedom without a powerful advocate, which she fundamentally lacked. Her body was her own. But in the absence of legal recognition, it became an object that others could claim, exploit, and discard without fear of retribution. Laws that existed to protect the vulnerable, such as prohibitions against excessive cruelty to slaves, would rarely, if ever, be applied to an orphaned girl simply because there was no one with the standing or influence to bring such a case forward. Furthermore, her social helplessness was equally profound. Society was organized around kinship groups, guilds, and communal ties. An orphaned girl was outside all of these. She had no one to vouch for her character, no one to introduce her to a community, and no one to provide the social capital necessary to secure a place, however humble, within society. She would be viewed with suspicion, as an outsider, a potential vagrant, or a source of trouble. This exclusion meant she had no one to turn to for help, no one to share a meal with, and no one to offer her shelter out of familial obligation. She was a ghost in the social fabric, unseen, unheard, and utterly unvalued. This absolute legal and social helplessness meant that, for an orphaned girl in 550 AD, her life was entirely subject to the whims and cruelties of others, with no legitimate path to assert her own humanity or secure her own safety. Number 2. The crushing burden of unrelenting labor. For an orphaned girl in 550 AD, life was a continuous, brutal cycle of physical toil, a relentless burden that began in early childhood and rarely ended until death. There was no concept of leisure, no playtime, and certainly no retirement. Every moment was a struggle for survival, and the only way to earn a meager existence was through back-breaking, repetitive labor, often under harsh conditions and for little to no reward. Imagine a girl perhaps as young as 5 or 6 already alone in the world. Her only hope of not starving or freezing to death would be to make herself useful, to find someone who might take her in exchange for her labor. This could mean becoming a scullery maid, scrubbing pots, fetching water, and emptying chamber pots in a wealthy household. It could mean working in the fields, pulling weeds, scaring birds from crops, or gathering firewood from dawn until dusk, her small body pushed beyond its limits. Her youth offered no reprieve. If anything, it made her more vulnerable to exploitation. The types of labor available to an orphaned girl were invariably the most physically demanding and the least desirable. She would carry heavy loads of water from a distant well, often multiple times a day, straining her muscles and stooping her back. She would spend hours kneeling to scrub floors, enduring rough surfaces and cold, damp conditions that would leave her knees aching and her skin raw. In agricultural settings, she would be exposed to the elements, working under a scorching sun or in freezing rain, her hands calloused and cracked from endless tasks like weeding, harvesting, or tending to animals. The tasks were repetitive, mind-numbingly boring, and often dangerous. There was no training, no proper equipment, and no consideration for her developing body. She would be expected to work as hard as an adult, often harder, simply because she was unpaid and easily replaceable. Her nutrition, already precarious, would be further depleted by the caloric demands of constant physical exertion. She would be perpetually exhausted, her muscles aching, her mind dulled by the ceaseless grind. Accidents were common in a world without safety regulations. A slip with an axe, a fall from a ladder, or an animal's kick could result in crippling injury, which for an orphaned girl meant certain death or permanent disability, leaving her even more helpless and dependent. The relentless nature of this labor meant there was no time for rest, for self-care, or for any form of personal growth. Her hands would be gnarled, her face prematurely aged by sun and hardship, her body broken by the constant strain. This wasn't about building a career or saving for the future. It was about the brute fact of survival one day at a time. Each day a mirror of the last, filled with the same exhausting tasks. Crushing burden of unrelenting labor was a life sentence for an orphaned girl, turning her childhood into a grim apprenticeship of suffering and ensuring that her existence was defined by toil, pain, and the never-ending struggle to simply endure. Number 1. A life without a name, without a future, without hope. The cumulative weight of all the bleak prospects for an orphan girl in 550 had ultimately led to the most profound and terrifying reality of all: a life stripped of identity, devoid of any discernible future, and utterly without hope. Her existence was not just precarious. It was essentially erased, a non-entity in a world that valued lineage, property, and defined social roles above all else. She was, in the starkest sense, a girl without a name that mattered, a future that existed, or a flicker of genuine hope. Imagine what it means to truly be nameless, not just forgotten, but never truly recognized. Without a family to bestow a surname, without a community to acknowledge her lineage, an orphaned girl could easily slip through the cracks of existence, her birth unrecorded, her life uncelebrated. She might be given a generic moniker, like the foundling, or the girl from the street, labels that further stripped away her individual humanity. Her personal story, her unique spirit, would be utterly lost, replaced by a generic categorization of destitution. She had no history, no roots, and therefore, in the eyes of society, no claim to personhood beyond her immediate utility. And without a name, without recognition, there could be no future. The very concept of a future implies a trajectory, a path, however humble, that one might follow. For an orphaned girl, no such path existed. She could not inherit land, as she had none. She could not join a guild or a trade, as she lacked family connections and skills. She could not marry into a respectable household, as she had no dowry or reputation. Her future was not just limited, it was non-existent beyond the next meal, the next shelter, the next moment of simple survival. Her days would simply repeat, a continuous loop of struggle, with no upward mobility, no change in circumstances, and no chance of escaping her grim reality. She was trapped in an eternal present of hardship. This absolute lack of a future, this absence of identity, cultivated an environment where hope simply could not flourish. Hope, at its core, is the belief that things can get better, that one's circumstances can change, that there is a purpose or a positive outcome to strive for. But what hope could an orphaned girl in 550 possess? Every door was closed to her, every avenue led to more hardship. There was no rags to riches story for a girl who couldn't even read. The concept of agency, of making choices that could positively alter her life, was a complete fantasy. She was destined to live a short, brutal life, marked by hunger, disease, violence, and ceaseless labor. Dying as anonymously as she lived, her existence would leave no trace, no memory beyond the fleeting impression she might make on those who exploited her. This ultimate bleakness, the complete erasure of self, the nullification of future, and the total abandonment of hope, was the most devastating prospect of all. It was not just about physical suffering, but the spiritual and existential devastation of being utterly insignificant, a forgotten soul in a harsh and indifferent world, destined to vanish without a trace, as if she had never truly been.